Pornhub entered into a deferred prosecution agreement. We're going to enter into this agreement. We're not going to be prosecuted. We're going to pay restitution. We'll pay fines, but we're not admitting guilt or wrongdoing.
The regulatory bodies get to put their regulatory hands over his mouth and say, shut up and take it. That's what gets to happen in our country. That's what's happening with Pornhub. That's what happened with Facebook. Morning, Sean.
Good morning, and it is definitely the morning, and I am feeling it. How are you?
I'm doing well. We're actually retaping this one because of some technical glitches. And apparently, talking about internet controls, Sean, the internet, the Cosmopolitan, does not allow you to store information in the browser, probably because they don't want people watching and recording what we're about to talk about today, which is porn.
Probably. But yeah, we're re-recording this one, and I think it's going to be even better because, you know, we get an opportunity to understand what it is that we were talking about and sort of some of the areas where we may have stumbled, but now we get an opportunity to come in fresh and clean. And I'm using all these terms that are used in porn, fresh and clean. I got to be careful about that. But I think what people need to understand is when we're talking about porn, we're getting ready to talk about porn from an incredibly important standpoint, which is freedom of speech.
Porn has been the guardian of our freedom of speech for a long time. If you stick around all the way through this episode, you are going to learn the importance of Hustler magazine to our nation's free speech, not just our ability to have smut, but also our ability to protest and do other things. You're going to learn about how the government uses some of the tools at its disposal to try to control corporations. And I think you'll have a completely new look at this sort of like dark shadow government that we have going on, which is regulatory control inside corporations. And what I'm really calling a new form of communism, how the government has the ability to get inside corporations with false allegations, control those organizations, and make them do exactly what the government wants. We're seeing this with Google. We're seeing this with TikTok. We're seeing this with Apple, every major company. And of course, we're seeing it with Pornhub. But the reason why we're talking about Pornhub today is not just because it's salacious and it relates to porn. Traditionally, it was the pornography industry that would stand as a guardian against some of these things. But we're finding out that that's not the case. And we're going to dive a lot deeper into it, which gives us a lot of fear that our First Amendment rights are going to slowly erode a bit more because we don't have those traditional guardians that we used to have. So let me back up a second. And I know that when we first taped this, we talked about it as well. But there is a bit of a problem in our regulatory industry right now. Everybody knows that Chevron deference has fallen. We've talked about it on the show before, but for those who haven't seen it, certainly go back, I think episode 2, take a look. But I'll lay it down one more time. We have this system of regulatory agencies in the United States where the agencies get to decide how to regulate certain industries. The EPA gets to write regulations as to how tall a smokestack should be. Well, one of the problems that we're starting to see is that those agencies have kind of a revolving door to the private sector and specifically large companies because they can afford former Department of Justice officials. They can afford people from the big law firms. And what you see is this revolving door that goes into 3 different buildings, one of them being the large companies, one of them being the Department of Justice, and then one of them being the agencies, so that regulations are created and only the big organizations can follow those regulations. And when they don't, they can get slapped with fines. So they hire former Department of Justice people to help them out and guide them through it. Then the little guy gets slapped and the little guy gets shut down. So Pornhub just got hit with criminal allegations as well as an indictment by the Department of Justice. And basically what that's telling us is Pornhub is big enough to be part of that club, right? To be part of the regulated entity who now needs to hire the type of people that the Department of Justice and the large law firms wanted to hire in order to protect itself. And we'll go through those allegations quickly, Sean. But certainly as we unpack this, it's quite scary what's happening in the industry.
It is. And one of the things that we talked about the very first time when we were recording this is the fact that Pornhub entered into what's referred to as the deferred prosecution agreement. And I think it's important for the listeners, the viewers, to understand what exactly is a deferred prosecution agreement. I mean, I could explain it in very simple terms to say the defense knows that the government has enough information, they have enough on the individual or individuals to secure a guilty verdict. And rather than going to trial and fighting it and spending all this money and subjecting themselves to what one can only describe as a horrific time in litigation, they say, we're going to enter into this agreement. We're not going to be prosecuted. We're going to pay restitution. We'll pay fines, but we're not admitting guilt or wrongdoing. Is that a fair way to explain a deferred prosecution agreement?
That's it. And we're going to go through the full Pornhub deferred prosecution agreement here so that everybody gets to understand how that is used to control companies. So let's go back. There was a porn producer out there that went by the name of Girls Do Porn. Some people may know about it. And from what I understand happened, this person this company would film people engaging in certain actions and then tell them that unless they did other things, they were going to release this video to family or online or whatever it was. And of course, we do have controls over the taping of porn in our country, and we obviously have laws related to consent. And there are also laws in many states regarding revenge porn where you're not allowed to put something on the internet without the consent of the individual. And of course, this violates all of them. So this person is understandably indicted, and that's something that I would absolutely support. They get charged. Unfortunately, though, the charges were a little different than we would have expected. They charged this person with a sex trafficking allegation. The government always has these strange ways to beef up charges. What was kind of a lack of consent issue, and certainly a very serious crime on its own, they made it federal by making the allegation that because maybe they paid for travel to get them from one state to another, this is now a federal sex trafficking offense, which can get you, I believe, up to a lifetime in prison. But one of the concerns that I have with that type of charging is that it kind of waters down the traditional sex trafficking that we normally see. And it also is quite inflammatory when we look at the nature of the offense, right? With traditional sex trafficking, we think is like going and like enslaving people from other countries or other areas and bringing them to a place. And that's a much different crime. We have other crimes on the books to charge this person with, but regardless, the government charges. But when the government charges somebody with that, and when they convict somebody of that, they don't just stop there. That's not what our federal government does. Our federal government always needs to climb up the ladder. And GDP, we'll call it, Girls Do Porn, they put most of their content on the platform Pornhub. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, because there's something called Section 230 out there, Sean. And this was a law that was passed a long time ago, and we have to get into it. It was back in the 90s, and Congress was essentially reacting to a string of court cases. We had a lot of internet chat forums out there, and some of you may recall back in the 90s, the early internet, you could jump on a message board and send a message to 300 people inside of a chat room, basically with anything that you wanted on it, any picture, any video, and that obviously created a very dangerous situation. People were using it to conspire to commit acts of terrorism. Some of the Oklahoma City potential conspirators were on these types of platforms. You had anti-government speech. You had a lot of problems going on the platform. There's nothing particularly wrong with anti-government speech, but when it plots to commit a crime like assassination or something, then that becomes a big problem. And so there was a lawsuit against one of the companies. I believe it was called Net Zero. And the lawsuit was that you're basically contributing to some of the criminal actions that are occurring on the platform, and we need to take you over and we need to shut you down. Well, they fought that, and they said that, hey, listen, we are not the curator of the speech. We're not the people that are making the speech. You need to go after them. We are nothing but and I love this analogy, we are nothing but the kind of message board you see in the back of the Starbucks on the wall in the hallway. Somebody puts their business card on there. Somebody puts a note on there. It's not our responsibility. What they say, we are a platform. We are not like a curated magazine. Well, Congress listened to this, and Congress was appropriately convinced that if we are going to have an internet that flourishes, if we are going to create this new system of communication, then we need to give people immunity from the things that happen on these message boards and the things that happen on the internet as a whole or social media channels. Because if we don't give them immunity, they will just drown in lawsuits and they will never be able to grow as organizations. Imagine if, as soon as Facebook gets started, in a bedroom in Harvard, they face a very quick lawsuit alleging that they used somebody's identity improperly because somebody else posted a picture that was unauthorized. Imagine we get a lawsuit like that. Facebook doesn't get off the ground. Now, I'm not so sure whether these things have value to our society, but I think the ability to own a business on this new platform and this new Wild West and the ability to grow a business does certainly have value for our economy. So Section 230 was passed into law, and Congress said, essentially, it gets more complicated than this, but essentially you get immunity for the things that other people post, provided you are not curating this content. Many people out there are probably saying, okay, curating. What about all of the censorship that we are seeing on the internet these days? How does that apply? And we're going to get to that a little bit more towards the end because we have some ground to cover before we fully get there, Sean.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. So again, when you're, for our folks who are listening and watching this episode, when we're talking about Section 230, you're talking about 47 U.S. Code Section 230, but it's tied to the Communications Decency Act of 1996. And again, as you were talking about, it protects online service providers and users from being held liable for content created by others. But I think, and I'm really interested in getting into this as we get, through it with Mark Zuckerberg and the fact that they have disclaimers where it says anything you post onto Facebook, we now own the rights to that. They own your pictures, they own your content, they can censor that information. They're no longer exempt, in my opinion, because now they've gone from just an online platform to controlling the content. But I can't wait to get into that.
That's what we're going to have to cover after, because I think some of the concepts that we'll go through won't make sense until we really cover it. So let's get back to GDP and Pornhub. So Pornhub finds itself under investigation. Now, Section 230 does not protect an entity from criminal liability, right? So you can't sue this internet platform under 230, but it's not going to give you immunity from criminal liability. So the Department of Justice comes knocking and they say, hey, Pornhub, there was this GDP website and they were trafficking. And here's where I start to have a problem. You should have figured out that they were doing this and stopped it. And because you allowed it to happen and because they made money from you, you're complicit. Now, in our system of laws, in order to commit a criminal offense, you need to have intent to commit that offense. And you need to have knowledge that what you're doing is a criminal offense. And traditionally, the knowledge that you can attribute to somebody is knowledge that the conduct that they are engaging in is a violation of the law, and knowledge and intent to engage in that activity. Pornhub has started an internet platform, and people put videos on it, and they have some controls in order to figure out whether those videos are legitimate or authorized. But for the most part, the people that upload the content are responsible for the things that they're putting up there. Well, the government said, yeah, we know that you may not have actually known that this entity was doing this, but you should have known. And should have known allegations are a huge problem for me. It comes from this theory called deliberate ignorance or willful blindness. We hear it said two different ways. The concept of willful blindness is a way that the government tries to hold you responsible for something, even though you didn't actually know what was going on. Many people may have seen Johnny Depp in the movie Blow. I think I can use a good example from that. Picture yourself, 1970s. You see Johnny Depp walking through the airport. He's got this like beautiful blonde hair. He's got that 70s suit with the peak lapels just popping out there. He's got two flight attendants behind him, and they both have large suitcases. You see him walking through the airport. You've known that Johnny Depp had some connections with Pablo Escobar down south there, and he was about to board a flight from there to the United States. And he stops and he says, you know what? I forgot my wallet today. Hey, Sean. He's got a Boston accent, I think. So he goes, hey, Sean, I need you to take these suitcases and I need you to get them to New York. All right. You're like, okay. And he says, I'll give you $10,000 a suitcase. And you say, okay. And he says, but don't look inside. Don't look inside. And you say, okay. You grab the suitcases. You go to the nice Pan Am attendant there. And she hooks you up with a ticket. You get on the plane, you land in New York. And they pop open your suitcases, Sean, and there's 15 kilos of cocaine, which is probably going to net you a sentence of about 20 years. Now, had you not talked to your favorite lawyer, you probably would have said, I had no idea that was cocaine in there. But the agents would have said, okay, we saw you on the cameras talking to George Young, Johnny Depp's character, who's a prolific drug trafficker. We saw you get the suitcases from him. You indicated before boarding to the flight, to the people who check you in for the flight, that nobody else packed your bags and all of that certification that you give previously. You should have known, and you really did know, that there was something in those bags. That is legitimate, right? When you have enough to show that somebody just didn't discover that they were committing a crime, hey, take this car and get rid of it. For those people who saw, what was that movie with Brian, that show with Bryan Cranston? He was a judge and his son hit somebody in a car accident. Fantastic show.
Your Honor.
Your Honor, yeah. So when they dispose of the car, hey, just get rid of this car. That's a situation where you probably should know that this car may have been involved in illegal activity. Those are really good cases of you should have known. And the critical difference here, and this is covered in a case called Global Tech, the critical difference here is that if you fail to discover or remain willfully blind of a fact that shows criminality, then you essentially had knowledge. Well, this gets difficult with the Pornhub case and the GDP case, because it can hardly be said that Pornhub ignored an actual fact that they were aware of. The only argument here is that, generally speaking, you didn't have enough of a compliance plan to determine that this company was engaging in this sort of trafficking violation. And my hang up with all of this is, what sort of compliance plan helps you figure out that somebody is coercing these people in this way unless you have actual knowledge of it, right? That's the problem. Well, the shot that the government took here is the revenue model. And they claim that because of the way the revenue model is set up and because of the incentives on this website, they've created a system where crime can occur, right? It's essentially like charging eBay with selling stolen goods because somebody stole something and posted it on eBay, and eBay didn't have the ability to run the serial numbers and figure out that thing was stolen. It's a little too much, Sean, and this theory gives the government way too much power.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
If you had been lead counsel for Pornhub, would you have settled this case, or would you have said, absolutely not, let's take this thing to trial?
You ask me the questions that, when I answer them truthfully, they get me into trouble, Sean. This is where I have to spill the beans on what's going on in America and with our large corporations. First, there's not a lot of trial lawyers out there left that take on the government in trial. I mean, there's a group, NACDL, that I'm involved in. There's a lot of very good trial lawyers there. I know lawyers all across the country who actually take cases to trial. But one thing you'll notice about our friends at the large law firms is they very rarely ever go to trial, and most of their cases revolve around resolution in a civil context or something like a deferred prosecution agreement. That's normally what they will get. They don't often take the government on in trial. Why, you might ask, is that the case? Well, for a company like Pornhub, it's incredibly risky to go to trial because if you lose, the government has charged you with sex trafficking. The government has charged you with offenses that could put your corporate officers into jail for the rest of their life. So the stakes are really high because of this overcharging. That happens with everybody in the federal government. They overcharge the shit out of everybody. They label these crimes instead of, something lesser, they call it sex trafficking, and they say you were engaged in a conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. And now they say we can put everybody in jail, so it's very risky. But they also have such significant fines related to this that it's a huge corporate gamble. But there's also this other problem. The large law firms often contain people who were formerly in the Department of Justice. And they often contain people who were formerly in some of the regulatory agencies. As I explained earlier, the regulatory agencies increase the number of regulations you have to follow. The people at the large law firms want to maintain their large corporate clients because that's how they make a lot of money. And there's a revolving door between the people in the large law firms and the large corporations' in-house counsel, where the in-house counsel is closely aligned with the large law firm, and in many cases from that large law firm. And what keeps that large law firm employed? Well, something like a deferred prosecution agreement that has significant compliance requirements, right? Sometimes people might get the feeling that one thing that lawyers are very good at doing is generating more billable hours for themselves. And if you take somebody to trial and you get a verdict, you might get a lot of billable hours, Sean. You might make a lot of money from that. But one way you can make more money is if you settle your client into a deferred prosecution agreement that lasts for several years and that has onerous requirements like compliance checks, onerous requirements like industry impact assessments, public and legal cooperation, and continued communication with the government in order to ensure that the deferred prosecution agreement is upheld. That's one way that somebody from a large law firm can make sure that their billable hours for Pornhub are not just a few $100,000 or maybe a few million for a trial, but tens of millions of dollars, because now the government has gotten its greedy little fingers all the way into the depths of the corporation, and attorneys need to be there in every aspect in order to ensure that the cooperation agreement, the deferred prosecution agreement, is upheld. It's the guillotine over the neck of the industry, and the compliance counsel is there for years, holding the string to make sure it doesn't drop. Pornhub needs its attorneys. Its attorneys want Pornhub to pay, and that's a great relationship for everybody involved. Department of Justice gets its guy, right? They've pled guilty. Well, they've agreed to deferred prosecution agreement. Maybe they haven't fully accepted responsibility and have paid a large fine, and the press release goes out basically saying that the government got their guy. So a lot of backslapping all around, Sean. So that's why we're seeing less trials in our country. That's why we're seeing less challenging of the evidence and these government theories. And Sean, that question really brings us into why this is an erosion of our First Amendment rights, and is a very important question.
Let's shift to really, I think, where all of this started, and to the beginning, to the godfather, if you will, of the porn, of smut, Larry Flynt.
Yeah, my guy. Many people may have heard of him as a disgusting human being. I just still get flashes of Woody Harrelson, who just did a phenomenal job. I mean, I wish I could have seen the Larry Flynt movie part 2. Like, I just need a whole nother version of that. Maybe the origin story. I don't know. Like, I'm here for that. But for those who don't know, there was especially for the younger crowd here, I looked at our demographics, and we're really solidly into the 30 and 40 age group. I just wish some of our younger friends would enjoy long form content so they could learn the true story behind things, because You can't get this in a short, Sean. You need to stick around for the whole thing, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems that we have in our country is that people want quick. They want something. And I think the mainstream media and some of the influencers that are out there have gotten smart, and they know that they could use clickbait, and they can put something out there that's a 30-second video, a 1-minute video, a 2-minute video, and they're going to hold the attention of these people that have a very limited attention span, and they can get across anything that they want. And as long as they're cycling that same message again and again, and they do it in under 2 minutes, they're brainwashing people, man. I think we've become a very lazy, very ignorant society. And well, anyways, I'll save my commentary.
But let me just tell you, the humor that I get from like reels on Instagram, in some cases TikTok, just out of this world. I mean, it's a new form of comedy that I really enjoy, especially when it relates to like some of the nostalgic stuff in the 90s that you get to see. It's fantastic. So let's talk about Larry Flynt. A lot of people may think of him as maybe a disgusting person, a womanizer, but Larry Flynt was, I would say, for his time in the 1980s, one of the most important figures in the defense of our freedom of speech in taking on what at that point were my friends in the conservative party, or the Republican Party, but conservatives, who really were, I guess, pandering a bit to the religious right and some content restrictions and free speech restrictions. Sean, it wasn't always the left that were the fascist, woke speech moderators. It used to be the right. Back when we had to have explicit content labels on our CDs in the 90s, that was a big thing. Back when certain books were banned from schools and other institutions because they didn't have the right Christian teaching. It used to be that the right was monitoring speech. And a guy like Larry Flynt really speaks to me because left, right, whatever, it doesn't matter. He cares about the Constitution and he cares about the freedom of speech. And he made exactly the right arguments and spent a lot of his own money in furthering those arguments. He was sort of like a one-man ACLU when it came to the defense of the First Amendment. And he spent millions. He spent millions, and it wasn't just out of pride. Of course, he made a lot of money, but he thought that this was important. And, you know, it seems to me that Larry Flynt wasn't like a Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner's the kind of guy that donates to Bill and Hillary and kind of sits down and doesn't take any positions. And he just does his thing. But Larry Flynt was much different. He was always operating on the cusp, making sure that he defended his way of life and our country. And it was one of the most patriotic things that you could do. And it's these unlikely characters that we need to really look at. So let's talk about what happened and what he did. And for those people who haven't watched the Larry Flynt movie, it's fantastic. Do some of your own personal research. We'll probably put some links to cases for those people who love to read a little bit more about this in the show notes. I think, Sean, that if you get through a whole season of our show, you are going to have such a great practical knowledge of the law as it relates to our society that for those who follow along, I mean, you're really just getting kind of an inside seat to the best law school class that you really could get in practical law and historical law, the way that it really goes down inside of the courts.
Yeah.
So, Jerry Falwell.
You're going to talk about the liquor advertisement parody, right?
Oh yeah. Do you think we could even have a picture of that? That would be great if we could show it.
I think we could.
I don't know, because it was supposed to be too lewd. We'll see if we can show it.
I guess what was considered lewd during the 1980s versus what's considered lewd today are completely different.
Yeah, that's true. You can now watch a drone drop a bomb onto a Russian soldier and see them blow apart just like randomly on X, which is a bit of a problem for me. I don't like the content restrictions, but I'm not prepared for that sort of stuff, and I don't really want to see it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I guess you get what you get. So Jerry Falwell is one of these like TV minister guys, very important in the right Christian conservative movement. Larry Flynt came up because of his magazine Hustler. His magazine was specifically curated by him, and one of the reasons it started to fly off the shelves is because he was doing like smut or nudity in such a different way. Many of his pictures had political themes about them, and he was sort of sneaking his politics into some of these magazines, and it had a bit of shock value. And it really was kind of, he was one of the first movers in parody. There was a group, Two Live Crew. They had a song and a famous Supreme Court case where they won the parody argument. And Larry Flynt was doing this. And you saw some of these artists. We saw Andy Warhol doing some of this parody as well. And I think, Sean, if I had to say it, I'd say that Larry Flynt was kind of an Andy Warhol of smut. That's probably a good way to put it, or Hunter Thompson of smut. So we have these characters rising up in the lexicon. Well, Flynt decides to take a run at Jerry Falwell. And I'll just read this directly from the case. There was an advertisement in Hustler that depicted televangelist Jerry Falwell in a lewd and offensive manner, suggesting in jest that his first sexual encounter was an incestuous affair with his mother in an outhouse. Wonder what that picture looks like. That's fantastic. So Falwell naturally sued. He probably had his lawyer write a really mean letter first. Take it out of your magazine, or I'm going to sue you. And I'm pretty sure that Larry Flynt probably had that letter printed into a roll of toilet paper and wiped his ass with it. It was probably a very proud moment for him. And he said, come at me, bro. And that's exactly what Falwell decided to do. So Falwell sued for libel and invasion of privacy. And for those people who don't know what libel is, slander is kind of defaming somebody. Defamation is the overall claim here, but slander is the spoken word and libel is the written word. And so he sued for libel. But the jury dismissed the libel claim, acknowledging that no reasonable person could take the parody as factual. And basically what that means is no reasonable person would have actually thought that Larry Flynt was specifically claiming that this affair had occurred. It was so outlandish. And so Flynt got protection under the parody rules. One great example of parody that people probably are all familiar with, Saturday Night Live has the ability to use Kleenex or Advil or Fruit Loops in a skit, even though that is a trademark and you could get sued for using it, because they are engaging in the act of parody. And the Supreme Court has said a long time ago, in fact, in this Two Live Crew case, it was related to Pretty Woman, the song Pretty Woman. But in this Two Live Crew case, they said, we believe that parody is a separate form of art that needs its own protection. That's glorious, right? If you take something that is commercial speech and you make fun of it in a way that creates its own art form, you have created your own version of protected speech, and that has benefit to society, so we will allow it. That's exactly what needs to happen. You need to be able to make fun of things and make light of things, because oftentimes humor is very important political speech. In fact, The Daily Show on Comedy Central is a really good example of how many people want to digest their political speech, often as humor, because it's a little bit more inviting. And that's exactly what Larry Flynt was doing. So just because it happened inside of a magazine like Hustler doesn't mean it's wrong. Larry Flynt appealed. I think at first, I'm just getting a little bit mixed up on the trajectory of the case here, but I think at first I believe maybe the circuit court upheld. There was a bit of a battle here. I think the jury dismissed. The next level of court upheld or reversed the dismissal, and Flynt ultimately finds himself at the Supreme Court, where we have now a First Amendment case related to Jerry Falwell, this lewd advertisement and this insinuation that there was incestuous behavior. The Supreme Court's ruling determined that the smut magazine provocateur Larry Flynt had not engaged in any sort of violations and could not be sued because this was specifically parody. Huge, huge defense. Larry Flynt loses that, and we have a very different country going forward. One of the things that I like to do, Sean, is imagine what our world would be like had the Supreme Court not ruled in like Brown v. Board. Had the Supreme Court maybe not ruled a certain way in many other landmark Supreme Court cases, what would we look like? I think that they stand on guard to protect our fundamental free speeches, and I think that this is a very important case that we may have a very different world. We may have a world where free speech rights were closed in on because of a very conservative right-wing movement, and now only speech that they deem appropriate would have been able to be allowed, permitted.
I want to show you, I want to put something up on the screen, and I want to get your opinion on this. Okay. So tell me your first thoughts. So this is the lewd satirical advertisement about Jerry Falwell and how he kicked the goat out of the outhouse, and it gave him more room, and then talking about making it with his mom for the first time, and that looks don't mean everything to him. But here's the second piece that was done. And this one is meant to be taken seriously if you look at the very bottom.
I love it. I mean, that's not even difficult for me.
Yeah.
It's not even a close question.
No, but do you see what we are now able to get away with in this country? Could you imagine if something like what was done on the right about Donald Trump was done in the 1980s? And let's just hypothetically say that was Ronald Reagan, who's one of the most beloved presidents of all presidents. He's definitely ranks in the top 5 for me.
Oh, I mean, when you look at electoral college votes, I think he ranks in the top 1 in terms of a resounding sweep of the nation. I mean, there may have been some other elections where like 12 people voted because, you know, certain classes of people weren't allowed to vote that got more sweeping victory. But in the modern era, you know, that's a resounding victory.
Well, I mean, I'm not putting Ronald Reagan ahead of George Washington. I'm not putting him ahead of Ronald Reagan. I'm not putting him ahead of Thomas Jefferson, but I'm definitely putting him in my top 5. Listen,
TJ, George Washington, you got to take their statues down. You're not even allowed to mention them, Sean. That might be a free speech violation right there. Don't get me started on Charlottesville. Don't get me started, Sean. We talked about that in the last episode.
We did. And it's so interesting. And I don't want to get off topic, right? Because I want to stay on this, but it's so interesting to me seeing now the general reaction to the debate between Harris and Trump. What originally I thought was going to be the case, the narrative is not. And it's actually really interesting to see a shift away from the honeymoon with our good friend Comrade Kamala. But anyways, Comrade Kamala. I wanted to go back to Larry Flynt because I think Larry Flynt, some things that he did that people might not be aware of, for me are absolutely unbelievable, right? For example, during the period leading up to the 1998 impeachment attempt against then President Bill Clinton for having his extramarital affairs with Monica Lewinsky, Flynt actually offered up $1 million to any woman who would testify to sexual encounters with members of Congress.
It's important, Sean. We need provocateurs in our country, right? I mean, I want to go back to something you said earlier because we were talking about, like, could you imagine if you couldn't have that advertisement, like you splashed on the screen there? Could you imagine? I can imagine it's not that hard. Jordan Peterson lost his license to practice in Canada. And I don't want to misquote Canada. People can do this research on their own because I'm not incredibly knowledgeable about it. But from what I understand, one of the things that Jordan Peterson failed to do is properly gender people. That is a restraint on speech, and it is removing a right away from a person, the right to practice their chosen profession that they spent their entire I don't know, schooling and maybe their entire life perfecting, taking it away from somebody because you didn't conform to specific fascist speech. One of the other things I see is the declaration that Donald Trump, in telling people to peacefully go home after January 6th, has been repeatedly called somebody who is engaged in criminal speech because it's some sort of conspiracy. That is actually in the January 6th indictment against Donald Trump. It's not hard to imagine a world where speech is starting to be criminalized. Donald Trump, again, just in the debates, and I said, don't get me started on Charlottesville, but he's accused of condoning Nazi, racist, fascists because they have taken his speech out of context. The problem, Sean, with criminalizing speech or taking government action against speech is that you are making decisions about that speech in order to take that sort of action, which means you're making decisions about the individual. Speech can't harm people. Action harms people. Speech that causes an immediate criminal action, criminal conspiracy, or fire in a movie theater, we've said this in other episodes, that can actually harm people. That's where the courts draw the line. But what we don't do.
Yeah. So what happened was Ontario's highest court dismissed Jordan Peterson's appeal of the decision that he has to take social media training after some of his commentary was found to be demeaning in nature. Are you kidding me?
That is a restraint on speech. We have England jailing people for their speech, right? We have Venezuela, you contest an election, jailing people for speech. We have North Korea taking action against people because they communicate or they don't, give the proper respect that they're supposed to Kim Jong-un, I don't know who we're on these days. Bad haircut, the same thing over and over again is what we get. Why are they always chubby with a bad haircut?
Why are they chubby with a bad haircut and everybody who lives under their dictatorship rule looks like they suffer from bulimia?
Because he's eating all the food, Sean. He's eating all of it, right? I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah.
There's like 2 donuts in the country and he has them every morning. That's just how it goes.
Speaking of donuts, have you ever had the Enterman's Softies?
No.
Oh, let me just tell you. My wife said to me, God, you're like an old man. They're plain. They're just the plain donuts. Plain. And they're called Enterman's Softies. Oh, you dip them in a coffee? Goodness gracious. But I just wanted to finish the one thing.
Was that a paid spot for Enterman's?
It could be if they want to be a sponsor.
Insert it right there.
Hell, listen, I'll even eat one of their donuts and dip it in some of the, and the coffee that I love. You've been to Savannah quite a bit, right?
Yeah, I love Savannah.
Savannah Coffee Roasters. If you have not been there and you have not had their coffee, my friends, you are missing out.
Let's give it a try. Yeah.
Oh, it's unbelievable. I had them ship me these, 5-pound bags they ship us. And, oh man, I can't wait for when they get here. You open that box and the aroma from the beans comes out and the oils. And then oh, come on. Anyways, I'm getting off the track.
That sounds beautiful.
But what happened with the $1 million offer, it resulted in the downfall of Robert Livingston, who was a Republican representative from Louisiana and Speaker-elect of the House of Representatives, who wound up having to confess to adulterous affairs and resign from the House. I mean, this is good stuff. This is not bad stuff. Larry Flynt brought down a bad person.
Listen, Sean,
I love it.
Free speech churns up the sediment in our society and in our government and lets us see what is really underneath that water. And it's very important. Every time we have somebody who rakes up a little bit of muck, we need to value that person. And that's my concern with the fascism that we're seeing right now. That's my concern with making kids say a certain thing in school. That's my concern with punishing people online. That's my concern with the government. And we're going to get into this right now. And this is the segue. That's my concern with the government saying to Facebook, you need to censor people who are talking about the Wuhan lab theory. You need to censor people who are talking about certain COVID alternative medications that may be helpful. I have some personal stories that I can share with you about crazy things the government was doing around COVID in order to suppress speech. But whenever the government takes action to do these sorts of things, we need to be very worried and we need to be very careful about that, because the only time the government wants to restrict speech is because they want to give you their ideas and make them true. And let's be very clear, Sean, the government does not have the right to have its own ideas. The government does not have the right to have its own speech. The government is nothing but an arm of the people and the will of the people, moving in a direction that is appropriate, guided by a central document that protects us all. That's the role of government. It doesn't get to have its own speech, and it doesn't get to have its own ideas. That is our job, and that is 100% our right. So Mark Zuckerberg recently posted a letter clearly indicating that the Biden regime elected to censor certain speech on its platform and pressured them to censor certain speech on their platform. How does Biden get that right? How does Biden's Department of Justice get that right? They get it because of exactly what we saw here in Pornhub. And this is really the lesson of this entire, shall I say, class here. You overregulate. You tell Facebook that they have to comply with certain laws under the FCC, Communications Commission, and various other laws, Federal Trade Commission as well. You accuse them of having a monopoly. You accuse them of certain criminal actions. You say terrorists use your platform and therefore you are condoning this speech. We need to regulate you. So they get inside of the company and they get you a deferred prosecution agreement or a civil settlement that you have to comply with. And then when something like COVID comes along, they say, hey, Mark, remember that agreement that you signed a while ago that said that you were going to comply with some things? Well, Mark, imagine like Office Space, they're over you with a coffee cup, right? Well, Mark, we feel that you might be in violation of that because we've seen some people posting anti-government rhetoric or COVID Wuhan lab theory information or alternatives to COVID medications or vaccines, and we need you to take care of that. And Mark goes, no, we are, he would never say this, but we are proponents of free speech. We care about free speech. We are not going to restrict this. And in fact, I'm telling the entire world what you just told me right now instead of posting a letter 4 years later, right? Mark Zuckerberg didn't do that. Why doesn't Mark Zuckerberg do that? Well, Mark Zuckerberg has a public company at this time that's traded on the stock market. That's SEC regulation. Okay. He is an owner of an SEC regulated corporation. So the things that he says, very carefully monitored by the government. They're also monitored by the Federal Trade Commission because various advertisements appear on their platform. They're also monitored by the Federal Communications Commission because a lot of the laws that relate to communication are under their purview. There are probably about 50 other regulatory bodies that regulate Facebook. Any one of them can smack Facebook so hard that it effectively closes down. So if Mark Zuckerberg wants to squirm and say no, the regulatory bodies get to put their regulatory hands over his mouth and say, shut up and take it. That's what gets to happen in our country. That's what's happening with Pornhub. That's what happened with Facebook. And it's because of those regulatory actions and the threat of criminal prosecution and other regulatory action that the government gets to say, you will now do what we tell you to do, and you will now restrict the speech of individuals. So anybody who posts what we don't want them to post, they're going down. You will censor them and you will ban them. Google, here's what we want you to do. We think that there's disinformation about Kamala Harris existing on the internet. We need you to clean it up. So what Google does, any anti-Kamala Harris article, they move it down in the search results or they delete it. Or they expire the page. Next thing you know, Harris announces that she's running for president and you look it up. And the only search results that you get are pro-Harris news articles. The government says, hey, we're a little bit concerned about the fact that Kamala Harris isn't getting the same sort of traction and attention. We feel like you're swaying the election in the wrong direction for Donald Trump. We need her results to appear a little bit higher because we think that this is just unfair. So what do? They boost search results.
It's like I showed you in our last episode after the debate.
Yep.
I put in top lies of Kamala Harris, and what came up, the first 2 pages on Google were Trump being fact-checked. Not one thing about Kamala Harris. Not one.
The government has gotten inside of Google. The Biden administration was meeting with Google repeatedly around the time that COVID broke out. They have government regulators inside of Google. They are constantly making these sorts of decisions. And Google has not disclosed yet the amount of speech that has been restricted by the government. But we do know, because of various lawsuits, that there was pressure on these entities. And we know that Mark Zuckerberg took great pains to actually come forward and talk about the coercion that was happening by the federal government, by the Biden administration, because Mark Zuckerberg can read the tea leaves. He knows that Donald Trump is going to win this election, and he knows that the Biden regime and those people in power that he decided to side with earlier on with President Obama, and maybe even earlier than that, are no longer going to have power, and he needs to start doing things the right way because he knows that his biggest competitor, Elon Musk, is sitting there, and he's made the right allies, and he didn't allow his speech to be restricted, and he has an open platform, and Mark Zuckerberg's business model will effectively be dead unless he changes this a little bit, Sean. So here's what we have. Section 230 gives people immunity, but it doesn't give you immunity if you are curating the speech. It also doesn't give you immunity from a First Amendment violation. I posted something on my Instagram and X yesterday, at Ron Chapman, ATTY, if you ever want to follow me on X, that showed that TikTok violated me for a community guidelines violation for one of our shows. I posted a short part of one of our shows. So congratulations, we got violated, Sean. One of my friends who's a police officer reached out to me and she said, isn't that a violation of your First Amendment rights? And that's something that I should explain because a lot of people have that question. I've seen that question before. The First Amendment protects our speech from government action. It doesn't protect it from private action. But when does a private entity become an arm of the government? That is the essential question. My friend didn't know to ask, but that is the question that she's getting at. Well, when you have the government inside Google telling Google what to moderate, and you have the government inside Facebook telling Facebook what to moderate, and you have the government effectively telling us what speech is okay, the government is controlling speech by requiring these content moderations and restrictions, and we all have an amazing First Amendment claim. The next question, Sean, is why aren't we fighting it? Well, here's why. Because the large companies find it too expensive and their attorneys don't want to challenge these things. Pornhub should have come out right out of the gate and said, sex trafficking? Are you kidding me? People upload content to our platform and they verify that it's legitimate, and we run AI models to make sure people are of age and we do what we're supposed to do, but there's no sex trafficking going on here. Get out of here. Go away. Go away, little government. And we have a team of lawyers that we'll fight you with. Pornhub apparently is weaker than Larry Flynt here. This solo man with a small team of lawyers and his small magazine was not making nearly the amount of money, and he decides to take the government head on, but we don't have that anymore. Why? Because the people running these companies want to pander to the people in power because they find it too difficult to do so, or maybe they don't have the will. Mark Zuckerberg says, yes, government, I will restrict all of this speech because I won't fight you, and then later on posts a letter. Google does the same thing. Nobody is fighting for our First Amendment rights. And so our First Amendment is crumbling under our feet because we have given so much money and power to these organizations and they have no will to fight. So those people listening out there, the one change that you can make is to support entities that actually fight for your freedoms. Platforms like Rumble, they'll fight for your freedoms. They're an open platform, not engaging in content restriction. I'm not saying run out to Truth Social and start an account. But X seems to be a fair and open platform, right? I see people moving, and this will probably get our video cut, but I see people moving from YouTube over to Rumble cyclically because they are tired of the content restrictions and the community violations and the banning. Eventually, YouTube is going to become an echo chamber of its own woke ideas unless it wakes up. And so it's through this speech, this movement of content from one platform over to free platforms, that we can start to protect our speech, because we are voting for the companies that have our back in the First Amendment. You and I aren't going to be able to launch an effective First Amendment fight against the government or a large company. But what we can do is vote with our dollar and vote with our views, and go to those platforms that will protect us and will help us and are aligned with our goals and our views. It's about free speech, not specific speech. I don't want to go to a place where somebody says, "From the river to the sea" is a banned statement. I don't want to go to that place, because that place restricts speech. That speech needs to exist. I know we discussed that in maybe episode 1 or 2 and got into it a little bit, but that speech needs to exist. This speech needs to exist, and we need to protect it with everything we have. It's too important.
I agree. And I think we've talked about the fact that, just because something hurts your feelings and you don't like it, because I definitely don't like the statement "from the river to the sea," it still gives people like that the same freedoms that you and I have under the First Amendment. And you're right. Hopefully we don't get shut down by YouTube. Hopefully we don't get banned, because I think people need this content. They want this content. They're excited about learning and understanding what their rights are and how the law applies in everyday life to small things, not just the big things.
That's it, Sean. A couple other cases people can look at. I know we just got a few seconds here, but Zoran versus America Online, 1997, that's a really important case that established that platforms aren't liable for the content generated by their user, even if they're aware of its illegality. That is something that Pornhub certainly could have cited in defense of themselves. The roommates.com case, the court clarified that platforms are immune, but if they encourage unlawful content, they might lose the protection. We didn't see that indication here in the Pornhub case. I would have thought that would have been a shoo-in for victory in defense of that platform. We've got the Twitter case and Gonzalez versus Google. The Supreme Court kicked the can down the road and didn't really answer the Section 230 question last term. I expect this term we have a very important Section 230 case kind of on the horizon, where eventually the Supreme Court will get to it. People are trying to take down Section 230 and say that these platforms should not be immune. I have a problem with that, because my concern is that if they're slapped with way too many lawsuits of this nature, we won't be able to have this vehicle. Imagine if Elon Musk in X lost his immunity because people decided to write mean thingies on Twitter or X. We don't think that Musk would want to spend his $30 billion or whatever to buy that platform and try to create a free speech movement for us. So these cases are really, really important to your ability to say things online, to not have content restrictions, to get out from underneath the fascism. Nobody should be losing their license like Jordan Peterson. Nobody should be going to jail for talking about a migrant crisis in Britain. We cannot turn ourselves into Venezuela. This is the new fascism, where you have to wear a star, where they will break your windows, where they will jail you for the things that you say and the things that you believe. And if they're coming after our most basic speech, they will come after other things next. And that's not fear-mongering. That's the reality of what we're dealing with. Right now, we have a presidential candidate facing multiple indictments. And we have just recent news yesterday, the Department of Justice, as a result of a massive mistake made in 300 indictments against January 6 protesters, will be dismissing a lot of those charges. Sean, we're going to cover an episode on that pretty soon.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Make sure folks hit subscribe, because that's coming to you. We're going to break down January 6th in a way that you've never heard before.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning into The Wall. Ron and I hope you enjoyed this episode. We don't just talk about breaking down the barriers, folks. We're trying to blow them to pieces. So if today's show lit a fire under you, don't just sit there. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to click and survive. Please connect with us on social media and join the conversation on The Wall. Your feedback and support build a stronger community and brings you the content that you care about. So stay tuned for our next episode. And remember, the only walls that matter are the ones that you tear down.